Hey everybody, welcome back to another podcast. We're really excited today as we have a special guest that we met at an event that Leslie put on. And if you don't remember, Leslie is the president of PISA. And when we met Liz and we ran into her, we just knew we had to share her story. So eventually we convinced her enough to come on. So let's just start right into a little bit about Liz. So Liz Schwarze is a vice president of global exploration for Chevron Upstream. She's responsible for Chevron's worldwide exploration program. She also chairs the company's global exploration leadership team and is a member of Chevron's management committee. She was general manager of exploration for Chevron Asia Pacific based in Singapore, and immediately prior to the current role, she was the general manager of exploration for Chevron Africa and Latin America. Schwarze holds a bachelor's degree in geology from Duke University, a master's degree in geology from the University of Texas at Austin, and a master's of business administration from Tulane University. So you can see why we wanted her on the podcast. Hey Liz, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good. We're so happy to have you here today.
Awesome,
Thanks.
Liz.
I'm excited too. I knew when we met at Leslie's house and you told me all about flipping the barrel, I was like, I'm all in. Just let me know when.
Well, thank you so much. So let's dig right in. Let's let the listeners know a little bit about your life growing up and how did your parents, lifestyle impact you later on in life?
Yeah, it's funny, when I think about how we grow as people and as employees and as leaders, so much of it is based on our consequence history and how we bring that, to life every day. And so I grew up in kind of the traditional household. I was an only child. My dad had the career and my mom stayed home and supported his career and took care of me. But there were kind of three things I was thinking about to share about my childhood that sort of inform who I am today. One is we moved around a lot. My dad worked really hard and he was successful in his career. And at that time for his career, to get promoted meant that you moved. And so we moved probably, every 1 year to every 3 years. Second grade, I went to 3 schools. Sixth grade, I went to 2 schools. I went to 2 high schools, kind of stuff. So this just constant, change and getting into a new environment, I think really informed me. So I'm not afraid to move. I've never been fearful. I've been kind of bold about taking assignments, and I've never said no. When, Chevron said, will you go to Singapore? I'm like, okay. When they said, will you move to Bakersfield? I have to think about it a little bit longer, but I was like, absolutely, I'm all in for that. And being adaptable and being willing to change and do different things and go to different places, I think is just so important in life, but it's really important in our industry. And I think we'll talk a little bit about my long history in industry. So moving around a lot and change. The second is my parents are immigrants. So they both grew up in Germany. They independendly made their way to Boston. They met in Boston and got married and settled in the US. So, part of my whole childhood, we went back to Europe, pretty much every summer to go visit family. And then we lived in the Netherlands a couple of different times. So just this exposure to not living in the United States and different cultures was another part of my upbringing. And so in our industry, when you're working from people all over the world and you have opportunities to go all over the world, I think having some of that appreciation as a child just really set me up for who I am today. And then the third thing, again, kind of related to them being immigrants, is when they, and we'll get to, I'll tell this story and then we'll get to why a little bit later, but when they met and got married in the United States, they had no family. They were both all by themselves. They met each other, they had me, and they literally had, no other family to call upon, but they made really deep, long-lasting friendships. So I have all of these aunts and uncles and cousins that have no blood relation, but essentially helped form my childhood. And I think, in the event of my parents, those were the folks who would have taken me on. They probably would not have shipped me back to Germany. So this idea of your, work colleagues and your neighbors and everything, they can be family, just like family. And you need all those people to take care of you throughout a long career.
I love that you broke that up into those three specific pieces. So I think that being an immigrant, like you said, and then also, being able to adjust at such a young age, moving around, makes it so much easier that when you do get asked for those roles, you're like, oh yeah, no, I'll take it. Whereas some people might feel like they're not very sure or certain if they haven't traveled a lot. So I think that does say a lot about your childhood. What I think is really interesting too is when we first spoke, you talked about a sorority that you joined, and your big, which is a term that they use in the sorority, your big sister was a geology major at the time and told you to take geology. Little did you know you were going to fall in love with it. Later, after you graduated, you followed the same girl to the University of Texas to go to graduate school. How did you know that geology was right for you, and what made you follow your big?
So I never had an earth science class in high school, but I was really a science kid. Those were the classes that I liked the best and I did the best in. Never really liked writing papers, but I liked chemistry and biology and math and physics. And so when I went to college, I didn't really even like, I knew geologists. We had neighbors because I went to high school in New Orleans. We had neighbors in oil and gas, but I hadn't really thought about it as a career. And when I took the class, I just fell in love with it because it's all of the sciences all wrapped together. You need to know, you use all of it, and you need to know some of all of it to study the earth. And so that was a great fit for me. Plus I got an A plus. I think I got like 105 in the class because I just clicked with all of the subject matter.
Wow.
The other thing that's super awesome about majoring in geology is you have to go outside and look at rocks, right? And so we went on field trips and we went camping, and I never got a chance to do that as a kid. We just weren't campers or anything like that, except for Girl Scouts. But in school, all of a sudden it's really great subject matter, and you're out in, the outdoors, you're hiking, you're camping, you're looking at rocks, you're coming back at the end of the day, you're with your professors and your graduate students or your teaching assistants and your classmates, and you're having a beer at the end of the day. And there's just like this whole thing about the geology community and the subject matter. Like, I was hooked. I wasn't going to do anything different. I was like totally hooked. And so I declared that as my major. And, looking back, I think the one thing that I know students do a lot of today is really think about the future. And I don't know if it was just me or if it was the 80s, but I didn't really have a plan for how I was going to translate that subject matter into a career. And I wanted to go to work, and I wanted to have a career that was part of, and I wanted to go overseas. And so I had sort of all these dreams about what I was going to do with my life. But I didn't really have a plan for how I was going to translate geology into that. So I went to graduate school, and I applied to UT, and I applied to Colorado, and I applied, I think, to LSU, and I wanted to go in the South because my parents were still in New Orleans. And when I got into UT, my big was there, and it just made a lot of sense because she's like, well, you can come here and you can hang out with us again, and I've got a place for you to live, and it's all settled. And I was like, for sure. The other thing about graduate school that I think is still true today is, depending on where you go, it can be really affordable. And so the University of Texas, even though I was a Louisiana resident, offered me in-state tuition because they gave me a teaching assistantship job. And so for very little money, I was able to get that advanced degree, and just sheer dumb luck in a college and a department where the oil and gas companies were still hiring, even in 1989, 1990 timeframe, which looks a lot like today. In terms of getting out of school and getting a career. So I knew it was the right subject matter, wasn't really sure what to do with it. I went to graduate school, I interviewed for internships, had this internship with Chevron, and decided this was definitely the industry and the career path and what I wanted to do with my life. There's no turning back.
Wow, so it was a match made in heaven.
It was
What
absolutely.
I find funny on with the geologists that I know is I feel like all the geologists are super passionate about their degree. Like they love rocks. You know, they're the people that
Yeah.
have like pet rocks on their, desk. And so it's interesting to see everyone's so passionate about it. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, when we
So
go, my daughter doesn't ask me this too much anymore, but we used to go on family trips. She'd pick up a rock and she's like, "Mom, do you want to look at it?" Like, yes, I know that's what geologists do. We have to get the rock wet so we can look at the minerals and the grain size, but not today.
Nice. All right. Well, like you mentioned, when you were, graduating with your master's, the oil industry was going through another downturn, very similar to what we're feeling today. And when you got your first job and you were, you were first hired, you were in the office, people were getting laid off, people were getting packaged out, and everybody's kind of walking out their boxes. And this one guy said, good luck, staying in this industry, as he's walking out the door. What
Yeah.
kind of advice would you give those who are maybe starting any position or who have been here, less than 5 years and felt that this year? Because it is uncertain, but that happened to you back in the early 90s, and here we are in 2020, and it's happening all over again, and you're still here, you still have a job. So
Yeah.
how do we work around that stress?
The oil and gas industry is, it just goes in cycles. And, I've been through probably 4 different cycles where it goes, up in terms of activity level, and then it goes down in terms of activity level. And basically it's because we're a commodity business. Essentially what we do is based on global demand and, how that's affected by forces that are completely outside of our control, like global pandemics or, other things that reduce demand or increase demand dramatically. We went through the period of time of, real broad globalization and economies growing at a really fast pace, then you really couldn't keep up with demand. And that was kind of that time period from, the early 2000s to, maybe 2012, 2014 kind of time frame, with the exception of 2008, 2009. So you're always in a cycle. If you're either in an up cycle, you're in a down cycle, you're in a steady cycle, but there's always sort of a cycle to it. And as I look back on my career, more often than not, we're in kind of an environment like we, are like we are today, right? So the 1990s, oil prices were pretty flat. They were like up a little bit, up a little bit, down a little bit, up a little bit, down. Capital was really tight. But we were super innovative. We thought about different ways to, reduce operating expense. I was on an operating expense benchmarking team in 1993, I think. Right. So all those things that we're doing today to help our industry thrive into the future are things that we've been doing before. And I think when we go through these changes, it's really an opportunity to be even more innovative and think about ways to do things more efficiently, more effectively, use data more effectively. So it can be, it's daunting, but it's also, this time of change leads us to have sometimes opportunity. And I think about the stress of these downturns, right? You need both coping mechanisms, and even more important than coping mechanisms, you need to be able to thrive. And so I think about, kind of a couple of buckets of that. First is just staying healthy as a person outside of work, and whether that's, exercise or family or some other interest other than work. I think that's really important for everybody to have in order to cope and then thrive, right? It's just sort of being successful in something else that you're doing. The other big coping mechanism for me, and I think it's a really good one to thrive as well, is just to learn all the time. It's just be a continuous learner, no matter where you are or what you're doing. And so if you're just coming into the industry and you've landed a role, focusing on learning, you're just a ton to learn, right? And so you can focus on learning all the things about your job and about the people around you, and you can use that in the future for other things. And you can also focus on learning, even outside of the workplace. So in the early 90s, I went back to school at night. That's why I have an MBA, is because I kind of learned early on I needed an alternative, because the one thing when you walk in the door and someone's like, yeah, good luck, is okay, well, maybe this isn't going to be like my forever home.
Mhm.
So I need some kind of other skill set other than other than maybe geology. And that that led me to go get an MBA at night. I think we're lucky in many ways in the world we live in today, because the ability to learn is so much easier. You don't have to go back to school for a big, long degree. You can watch TED Talks. You can, queue up a bunch of podcasts. You can consume new knowledge in so much easier ways. And so I have a friend who listens to high tech podcasts, walking every day. I've been trying to listen to books on Audible to kind of learn about things. And I think that helps a lot with the stress of the environment, is just thinking about, okay, how do I turn coping into thriving, and what will it take me in order to thrive? And just have a way to take care of yourself outside of the office, lean on family and friends, have think through, what do I want to learn in order to be able to sort of, thrive with alternative jobs in my company. So we see people kind of go from the job that they were hired for into other jobs in order to be retained, or, jobs that are going to land me another role in another company. But it's a great industry, and it's going to be around for a really long time. It's tough now, but, and it's easy for me to say because I've been around for 30 years, but it changes,
Mhm.
Our reality today is not going to be our reality tomorrow.
What I think is really important is what you stated when you gave options here that cost nothing to the individual.
Right.
So like you said, there was a time where, like in the 1990s, like you said, you would probably have to spend money to go to school in order to learn something. You can literally go on YouTube, on podcasts, and there's so many things you can learn and do. Hence, like Massiel and I started a podcast through this pandemic. Well, we started over a year ago, but we've been thriving through the pandemic doing it. So there's options, for you to continue to learn where it doesn't cost you anything but your time. And I think that can really help people who, need to learn how to cope outside of their day job. So thank you for sharing those things. And I think this really segues right into our next question. Like you mentioned, you worked for Chevron for over 30 years. You've seen more than most people have seen that we've ever talked to. And one thing you mentioned when we talked was how the oil and gas industry is so resilient. One where we manage massive projects, very cross-functional, huge multi-million-dollar projects, might I add. And we have a very talented pool of people, and this can transition easily into other industries. What skills have you seen stand out the most that other industries could learn from?
Yeah. So take it with a grain of salt, because I've been in oil and gas for 30 years and I've only worked for Chevron. But, when I think about what we do as an industry and what so many of us do as individuals, there's some really translatable skill sets, right? One, almost everything we do cross-functionally, because what we're dealing with, particularly in the upstream, right? We're dealing with the complexities of the earth below us. We can't see it. We have some data, but it's really complicated. So you kind of always need some subsurface people. You need some facilities people, so like the chemical engineers and electrical engineers and the operators, and you need wells focused people, whether it's drilling or completions, or doing diagnostics on a producing well. So I think even though sometimes we might feel in our roles, particularly like early in a career, that you're just really focused on one path, you're more cross-functional than you think, because the problem you're trying to solve is a big cross-functional problem. Your piece of solving that problem might be a particular area of technical expertise, but as long as you're reaching out to your team members more broadly and not just a mentor maybe in your area of technical expertise, you're building those cross-functional skill sets. And I think that's completely translatable to any industry you look at today with the complexity of the interconnected world. Everybody's dealing with how do I solve a problem that no longer has fixed boundaries? And we know how to do that because that's what we do every day. Mm-hmm. Another thing we do is we manage projects. And I think you would be surprised at how many people just don't have basic project management skills, right? So what problem are you trying to solve? So you're framing a problem, figuring out what's in scope, figuring out and deciding what's not in scope for the project, and then building, whether it's a, big fancy resource loaded work plan, or it's a, checklist on the back of an envelope. Pretty much everything that we're doing, like my whole life is managing a project. And that's a really translatable skill to wherever you go, that ability to frame the problem, consult stakeholders, build a plan to tackle the problem, consult stakeholders along the way, and then deliver an answer. A third thing that I think we're really good at is we live in a constant world of uncertainty. And again, particularly in the upstream, essentially what we're doing is we're producing molecules of hydrocarbons out of a reservoir that's deep below the surface of the earth. We have some data to describe it, but we never have all the data. And so we're building, we live in a model-based world, right? So we're always building a model of what that subsurface is going to do, and then we're applying something to intersect it to, do something, whether it's drilling a well or, building a flow line or a facility. I would argue that we're never 100% certain of, precisely what's going to happen. We've built a model and we've bracketed the ranges of possibilities, and then we work within that. And so living in this world of it's okay not to know exactly the answer as long as you've been very data driven in building your boundaries. I think the skill set that we have in our industry that's transferable elsewhere. Because it's like, do you know the answer? No, could be this, could be that. It's not this and it's not that. It's somewhere in here. That's what we do all day, and not everybody does that. And maybe a fourth thing, a quick fourth and fifth thing I think about is just the volumes of data we deal with. So whether we know it or not, we're all data analysts, and we have been for decades. It's just cool to talk about it now. And we're also, for the most part, we're really global because oil and gas is just all over the world. And you might have a role that's very focused on, maybe it's Midland or maybe it's Bakersfield, but you really have the opportunity to think globally and intersect with people from other countries, people from other cultures. And that's something I think that's a bit unique to us. So we have a lot of skills. I'm glad you asked me that question, and we talked about that a few weeks ago, because it's made me really think about, how would somebody maybe write their resume a little bit differently to reflect not just what they do, but how they do what they do. That how that's, I think, transferable.
Yeah, no, totally. Thank you for sharing that. And I think we've seen it during this pandemic with so many people getting laid off from the oil field. And I see it on LinkedIn all day long. People going to Amazon, going to Apple, going to Google, going to the tech industry, back to a food industry. So I think, like you said, there are so many things that you could bring from being in oil and gas and like the hard work, the 24/7 hustle, that other industries are like, wow, these people work so hard, So I think we've seen it. So everything you said is true. So many people are transitioning over right now. So, So we know you are the VP of Explorations at Chevron. You've been there for 30 years. You've obviously made an amazing career for yourself and, constantly climbing up in your career. I think when we first spoke, I mentioned, were you always thinking of the next job that you were going to get? Were you, thinking I'm going to be VP, I'm going to be CEO constantly throughout your career? And you mentioned that you really just focused on the job that you had. So it's not like you were constantly always doing that. Can you expand on that and how that has worked out for you?
Yeah, I think when I was early in my career, I was probably not that way, right? So I focused on the job I had, but I was more ambitious than I thought I would be, maybe is the way to think about it. And so that kind of I was for a long, and I probably still am, right? Thinking about what that next role is. And so what I like to say is the job you have today is more important than the job you'll have tomorrow. Budget your time accordingly. It doesn't mean don't think at all about the future. It means spend the bulk of your time really focusing on the job you have today. Because if you do that's like the pillar of the next assignment, is people around you being able to stand up and say, yeah, she's really awesome in this job, but she's got all these other skills, and so she would be really awesome in this next job. That's what you want people to say about you. Probably the time of my career where I really started to solidify that is at Chevron. We have a job called functional sponsors. So for 2 years, I was the earth science sponsor, which meant that I ran like the personnel committees for the earth scientists, and I went around the world and I gave career advice. And so I talked to all these people for this 2-year period of time. And so that was the advice that I gave them, was like, how are you doing in your current role? Like, what are you doing? What are you learning? How are you performing? And, people who would be like, well, all I want to talk about is what job you're going to get me next. That wasn't a very fulfilling conversation. So I would have to go back and say, focus on the job that you have today. And then people who would talk about the job that they're doing and not really think about the future, then the question I would ask is, okay, where do you see yourself next? What kind of advice have you gotten? What kind of classes, can you take? What kind of projects can you add to your day to get ready for that next job? And my dad had this really great advice. So his name was Herman, so I called him the Hermanisms. But one of them was, if you get into a new job, really think about that first period of time. Just learn the job and find those things in the job that just don't actually really have to happen. We all have them, right? We all inherit reports that no one reads, but we build them. And so, try to sort of jettison and stop doing the things that don't add any value. Check and make sure, but stop. And then there's a whole chunk of things that, if you're a supervisor or manager, you probably don't actually need to do. You could probably give those tasks to your direct reports and your team, and it would help them grow, and it would free up your time for other things. And so delegate, right? So stop doing the things that don't add any value, delegate the things that really ought to be delegated, and then focus the rest of your time on adding in those things that would add even more value. And I've always thought about it that way. And so I think about a job in kind of threes, like the first third of your time in a job, you're just learning the job and building the network of new stakeholders. The second third, you're making your changes. And the third is like you're seeing that your changes stuck and are making a difference. That's kind of a fun way to approach a role.
No, I like how you broke that up. It speaks to like each level. So thank you for sharing that. And that kind of segues also right into, when we talked last, you said that you had very strong female role models. You also role models don't just have to be VPs and CEOs, and we see that a lot where people think, well, I need a mentor, I need a role model, but I don't know anybody at this level. So therefore, I can't have that mentor that I actually need to help me. But you actually have a different perspective. You say that, it makes it much easier to relate if you can find somebody maybe within the role that you currently are in, or maybe just one level higher than you. Can you talk more about this?
So I'm really passionate of late about this whole concept of role models. And maybe it's because since I got into this job, I get asked all the time, like, how did you get to where you get to? What was it like growing up in this male-dominated industry? And I have to say, one, not my experience is not your experience, and your experience is not my experience. And so I was really, really fortunate as a woman coming into Chevron that my second boss was a woman. So just my team lead, right? Mm-hmm. And the head of our exploration group in New Orleans was also a woman. So I had these really two strong female role models, around me that I could interact with on a regular basis. And so I never remember thinking back then that, getting to a team lead or a manager job was out of reach for me, because I saw people who looked like me in those roles. Oddly, a more problematic issue at the time was geology versus petroleum engineers. And so, a lot of the team lead kind of jobs, if not all of the ones I saw around me, kind of went to, or these cross-functional team lead jobs went to people with engineering backgrounds. And so I was like, bound and determined to be a geologist who could make that jump as well. And that's the business degree came in as part of that, I have to say. And so think about role models more broadly than just, does that person look like me? It could be, does that person have a degree like me, or does that person have a life experience like me? So is there some way some way I think about myself in terms of my, leadership trajectory, and can I find somebody who has those attributes in a kind of job that I want to get to? And then that makes it look possible, right? It's the idea of, I want to look around and see people who are being successful with some of the same attributes I have, because that makes it possible for me to get there. If you're relatively early in your career and the CFO or the CEO is a woman, that's a great aspiration to get to, right? It's a great person, but your ability probably to spend time with that person from a role model perspective is probably pretty limited. So I really believe that we need a broadly diverse workforce in our industry. We need a broadly diverse workforce all the way from the entry level, all the way up to the top of the house, because then no matter where we are in our careers, we see somebody who can role model for us. And the closer they are to us, the more access we probably have to them, where we can go in and ask them some questions like, how did you address this? How did you get to where you are in this way? And, help me understand the things that you learned along the way, right? So share that knowledge. We talk about leaving the ladder down, right? Share that knowledge of the bad times and the good times that'll help me, get to that next point of success.
Definitely. I think representation is such a big deal. I mean, even like you mentioned, just starting a job and knowing that, there's in the C-level suite, there's a few women, even though they're not going to necessarily mentor you because there is that big disconnect and they are busy. It's enough. It's a good enough for you to feel like, okay, I have a place in this company. They actually do care. Look, there's 20% women on the board. But I think it is super important, like you mentioned, to have it across, right? Someone that's only a few years ahead of you, where you're like, okay, they're doing it, I could do it. Because sometimes it's hard to, relate to someone who's been there 20, 25 years and, have that. But I think part of the podcast was really, we wanted somewhat of that, is to high level women on who, you would never really necessarily have access to, share their stories and just, inspire you that, okay, she did it, so can I. So thank you for coming on and, sharing your story as well.
Well, you guys are role models too, right? You stepped out of your, you've stepped out of kind of the normal comfort zone to say, hey, I want to make this industry more accessible to people. And so you are role models as well. I think I told you I had a chance to participate with the Women Offshore Conference, right? And so the folks that lead that organization are role models. And so, every time we stand up and we do something to advance our industry and advance people in our industry, I think we're role models to each other. So you guys are role models for me.
Thank you. I know sometimes I feel like we forget about it, but we are.
Yeah, exactly. You do something that would be way outside my comfort zone.
Yeah. So this one, I love this question because I think it speaks volumes of just who you are and how hardworking you've been and all the sacrifices that you've done. So you mentioned that you were a single parent for, most of your entire career, and that means going back to school, getting promoted, traveling, moving. How did you manage being a single parent, which takes a big toll on your time? And still being able to spend 30 years at Chevron and be a VP. How did you do that?
My career actually took off when I became a parent. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And maybe that speaks to, having that thing outside of work that gives you balance and gives you that time to sort of think and rejuvenate overnight, because you're when you got a toddler at home, you're not working, you're like playing with the Legos and Barbies. And, for us, we watched a lot of Food Network. And so it just gives time for like the back of the house, your brain to, process what's gone on during the day in a way that's using a completely different part of your brain. So I think whether, parenting our own kids, parenting other people's kids is a good way to, it's a good sort of thriving mechanism, I think, as well. I mentioned my parents were both immigrants, and so we still don't have any blood family in the United States except it's like my mom, my daughter, and I. And so I knew, right, and I had a pathway to reach out to a broader community to support me and my daughter. And that's what you have to do. I think it's not easy, but it's not impossible to be a single mom and work in this industry. But you have to take that time to build really strong relationships outside of work, because those are the people you're going to call upon when your kid gets sick or you have to go on a trip or things like that. Probably the hardest time. So my parents moved in when she was a baby, and then they moved in again when she was in elementary school. But for a while, it was just the two of us. And I joined this really awesome church in Bakersfield. And so I had that family. We found a really great preschool. So when I traveled, I was like, oh, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And one of my church friends is like, well, just have somebody from the school come stay at your house. I'm like, oh, yeah. They've been background checked. She likes them. What's wrong with that? And so, we had this wonderful woman from the preschool who would come, stay at the house with my daughter for like the couple nights if I had to, drive up to San Ramon and go to a meeting or something like that, or fly to Houston, or my mom would come out. So you just like reach out really broadly. And, it's funny because people like to be helpful in general. Like that's just our nature. We just really like to be helpful. And I'm not naturally really good at accepting help, but I had to get good at accepting help. And I think that made me a better leader, because you can't run an organization and never ask for feedback or never ask for help. But if you're willing to ask for feedback and you're willing to ask for help, I think you're much better at delegating, developing others, and, and learning and recovering from mistakes. And sort of all these things that we want leaders to be today. We want them to empower others. We want them to be inclusive, right? That's what we aspire to be. As a leader, I want the people around me to be better than me. Mm-hmm. I want them to be more successful than me. And I think being a parent kind of helped me get to that place mentally, maybe earlier than otherwise I would have. So it takes a village, right? And so you got to build your village of people mm-hmm. around you. And the part that maybe was, oddly helpful was there wasn't anybody else to pay the mortgage or, pay for food. So those times where it got like kind of tough, I had to figure out how to stay the course.
Mm. Well, this is what I love about asking these kind of questions, because this is something that I don't think anybody would ever think of or know. And so many women struggle and they feel alone when this happens, when they are a single parent, or maybe it's their first time staying home alone and maybe they're not single, but their husband always travels. But yeah. You mentioned so many great things and so many great options for women. And that is one, to connect with those at your, your daycare or your preschool, or, think you don't just have to have family. It can be other qualified representatives, to help you out. And also, I think, like you said, as women, when you have kids, I feel like in our careers, we try to control so much. And then it comes to a point where you can't control everything. And you only maybe can learn that when you have a child, because you don't really have any other option. And then that in turn makes you, as you said, a better leader. So I'm really happy that you shared that with us. And to end, I think, this is a really concept that you brought up last time we talked, and that is the concept of sticking with it. Because this is a hard struggle, like you just mentioned. And, did you ever think of leaving Chevron? And what is your thought about women who leave the workplace due to kids or things in their life, where, you need that resilience and able to, stick with it and stay? How can you encourage women to actually do that?
Yeah, there's, have I ever thought of leaving Chevron? Well, once, and I don't think that's unhealthy necessarily, because I was at a place in my life, and there's like hard stuff at work, and I didn't really see this sort of career trajectory ahead of me, right? I was sort of in a place where I didn't necessarily see the possibilities that my company had to offer me at that time. So I called a friend, right? So networking is very useful, but having 4,000, contacts on LinkedIn that's 4,000 people who you're networked with on LinkedIn. That's not your people, right? You need your people that you can call upon. And that's a much smaller core group of, colleagues and friends that you can call upon for advice. So I was in this, point in my career, and I called a friend of mine who had left a few years earlier and gone to work for another company. And, we had a really good conversation, and she's like, look, just sit back, write your resume and write a cover letter, right? But the grass is not greener necessarily on the other side. So if they're good to you and you like your job and you like the people and you like the culture and you like what you're doing, you're better off sticking with it than, jumping somewhere else where you would assume that it's going to be better, but maybe it isn't. Mm-hmm. And I think our industry, we wind up having people, depends on where you are in the industry, but there's a lot of people who work for the same company for a really long period of time, which is different in other industries. Anyway, so I wrote up my resume and I wrote up my cover letter, but I had this really sort of deep thought about, I love what I do. So geology, and at that point I was in the planning space, but I love what we do as an industry. Like, our purpose is really profound, right? We provide, affordable, reliable, and ever cleaner energy to this growing global population. We support the growth of economies. We support the growth in lifestyle around the world with our products. And so it's a really noble industry, and it's a really great cause. And so I believe deeply in our purpose. Yes, the energy mix is transitioning, and we'll play a role in that because we're the energy, we're oil and gas, but we're part of the broader energy industry. But you have to believe in the purpose of what you do. The other thing that's really important is you have to believe in the culture. And so I love the culture at our company. We are really people focused. I can count on, less than 5 fingers the number of people I've really disliked over 30 years, which is just phenomenal. Wow. And even a couple of those folks, I figured out how to find something in common and get past we have a hard time working together part. So anyway, so I thought about leaving, and I sort of did this sort of task, and I called on this, trusted advisor, so to speak. And then I tore that all up, or I filed it away, and I said, no, I'm going to stay. Sick. The other time where I probably should have not left Chevron, but taken a leave, and I want to share this story because it's really important, is it's not just about having kids, particularly as women, it's about having parents. And that role of caring for aging parents, I think, is another role that oftentimes falls disproportionately on women. And so as an only child with 2 parents, my mom got sick, we had to put my dad in a nursing home, and I should have taken a leave of absence. Like, Chevron would have given me a leave of absence, my career would have been fine. I should have taken that time off, but I didn't. I put my dad in a nursing home. I was going back and forth, with my mom to get her rides to cardiac rehab. My daughter was in elementary school, and so I think she just totally got the short end of the stick during that period of time. And I could have managed it better if I'd just taken 6 months off. It just would have taken 6 months off. So, don't count out as you, sort of get older. Just don't count out that there's other people that are going to rely on you, and having a game plan for that is super important. But through it all, like I said, I love what I do. I love the culture. I can't imagine not being part of the Chevron family. And so sticking with it is just having a coping and a thriving mechanism for getting through these really hard parts in a career. And those hard parts are outside of work, right? Family stuff. And those hard parts are, when you don't get the job that you want, or you do get left, you do lose your job as part of all the restructuring that's going on, and thinking how am I going to translate that and come back, stronger, braver, fiercer, and stick with the industry. All these things that happen outside of us, they're really short-lived. Like a career's like 30, 40 years. That's a really, really long time. And if you let the first or the second thing take you out of the game, 5 years later, when you want back in the game, it's really hard. So you're better off trying to stick with the game. The world we're living in 2020, I think is going to provide so many more opportunities for, flexible work maybe, or, part-time or different things. So really think about how you can use this virtual environment we've built up around us to be in that coping toolkit when something goes on and you just can't be there every day necessarily. I think it's a bright future for our industry. It's a bright future for what we do. It's a noble purpose that we fulfill. We've learned a lot about our ability to work remotely for most of us. We've learned a lot about our ability to call upon others to help us. If we're going, if we have to go to the well site or the operations location, right, we're probably leaning on more people than we had to in the past. So we got to bottle up all of that knowledge and take it into a brighter future.
Totally. Well, Liz, thank you so much again. I mean, you've provided so many tips, tricks, advice. You've been a mentor on this podcast for a lot of women. And I truly believe is stick with it. It's easy to give up, but just do it, and like you said, a lot of things don't last that long. It may feel like the end of the world for that week, but like you mentioned, you have a 30, 40 year career ahead of you. You have bigger goals and dreams, and just focus on that, So I absolutely love it. Thank you so much for sharing and for spending your Monday morning with us. So thank you again so much. And hopefully we see you soon. We're all in Houston. We should get together.
Yep. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
We'll all get together soon.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.